for those of us who have a debt that we owe to the Protestant Reformation, yeah, we still value the Septuagint. I think it's an important thing to research and study.
Some of us do.
Some of us do. Some of us do. Yeah.
We can talk about that. But.
Yeah. Yeah. So how should we approach the apocryphal books? Sometimes that's an argument that's put forward. I hear there's quite a few Orthodox people who actually watch my channel because I've done quite a few videos on the Septuagint. How do we approach that?
Yeah, and we could come back also. I think it is interesting, the sort of Reformation approach to all this is probably worth commenting, because there's been a lot of conversation about that, and we cover it in actually 3 basic chapters in the book are devoted to things related to that. But in terms of your question about the Apocrypha, the whole history of the Apocrypha is quite interesting, and it's worth remembering that the earliest Reformation Bibles actually included the Apocrypha, not necessarily like scattered in there as if you finished Jeremiah and you end up in Baruch. They were typically treated in an appendix, but the Luther Bible and the King James and some of the other early ones had Apocrypha in them. And so there wasn't this pronounced allergy against them back then, but they all agreed, and we see this in our confessional standards that come from the Reformation, that these are not given by God in the same way or at all as the traditional Hebrew canon, but they can be useful for historical information, background type material. And they're actually getting that ultimately and somewhat ironically from Jerome. So if you trace everything back, there was debate about these books in the first couple centuries. And there was a big throwdown over them between essentially Origen, Jerome, and Augustine as to what do we do with these books? Are they inspired by God? And the general answer, with Origen as the main exception, is no. And the Jewish community certainly did not receive First Maccabees or Tobit or Judith or any of those as inspired. They were limited to the threefold Hebrew canon. That's very clear, very, very early. Then you have Augustine sort of saying, well, maybe we just kind of accept them because everybody's using them. And then you have Jerome actually is the one who comes on the scene and says, actually, both of y'all are wrong. The Hebrew canon is the Hebrew canon. The apocryphal books are interesting. He says they should not be used for dogma, but they can be useful for edification. And certainly, Tobit's pretty fun. When you read Judith, it's pretty fun when you read it. But there's no reason at all to think that they are verbally inspired by God. But what Jerome did that was interesting, that the Roman Catholics went one way and the Reformers went a different way, is he said, look, there's this intrinsic distinction between them. However, I'm going to still translate them in my Vulgate. So he's like, my Vulgate is going to go back to the Hebrew for the canonical books that are useful for dogma, because they're the ones that are inspired. But I'm going to throw these in there because they're out there, they're circulating. I'll translate those too. The vast majority of Roman Catholic scholars in the subsequent centuries agreed with Jerome. They didn't privilege the deuterocanonical books. It wasn't until the Council of Trent where they did. And they did that because the Reformers, somewhat ironically, sided with Jerome. They actually said, look, there's a distinction in the books here. You've got the Jewish canon that Jesus endorses, for instance, in Luke 24, the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's the canon. These other books are helpful and interesting. We don't have to demonize them, but we don't treat them as scripture. That was Jerome's distinction. And then what the Roman Catholic Church did in response to that, they anathematized anyone who actually made that distinction, which would have included Jerome, but then they adopted Jerome's translation and said the Vulgate, which he wasn't solely responsible for, is a team effort. They adopt that. So it's a weird historical way that all played out, where actually the post-Trent take on the Apocrypha that treated them now as Deuterocanon, second canon, was actually not the historical position. They take Jerome's Bible translation, but repudiate his actual treatment of it. And so that to me is a strange kind of historical way things played out. But history's messy. And then Greek Orthodox folks, if you look at the Greek Orthodox study Bibles or places where they make the statements about what they treat as normative, they simply say, we use the Eastern Bible, which for them is the Septuagint. They're never actually, so far as I've been able to figure out, they're never actually clear as to which manuscripts they're talking about. My gut instinct is that it's fundamentally Alexandrinus, but you never actually see them say that. And the reason why that's relevant is that the three major books that we're talking about, the ones you mentioned earlier, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, they don't actually have the same Apocrypha in them. They're group that none of them agree with each other as to which books are included beyond the traditional Genesis through Malachi. And so there is, if you go to Wikipedia, there is a Greek Orthodox Apocrypha list, and it's really close to the Roman Catholic with maybe one or two differences. But you're like, well, which manuscript is that? Because it doesn't actually match any of the manuscripts. So it's kind of honestly a bit of a Frankenstein list. So long story short, I tend to side with the instincts of Jerome and the reformers in terms of like the Apocrypha are interesting. In fact, I actually wrote a blog post on this, I think for Gospel Coalition a long time ago, that Protestants can actually find value in the Apocrypha. First Maccabees is the only historical source that we have for a lot of the history in between the Old and the New Testament. The wisdom of Ben Sira is interesting. It shows you what some Jews were thinking in that time frame as they themselves were reflecting on, say, the Proverbs or whatever. But there's no compelling reason to think that they were ever deemed as authoritative. In fact, the chapter in the book that I wrote in the Authority of the Septuagint is precisely on this issue. So I developed a handful of litmus tests, if you will, for why it makes sense that the threefold canon was the authoritative canon and not the Greek Apocrypha. So you can find out more by reading that chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great.